Okay. Okay. Let's continue with the next chapter. So that's chapter 4. And Longshan and Sheen. So that's the next step I'm going to cover here. So in the last week, we talked only about goods markets, or on Monday, right? So what I would like to do today is taking the next step in building a model of the overall economy. I'm going to talk about financial markets. Okay, so what I introduced today into the analysis is basically money. Okay, so we just look how financial markets work in a very simple way. And basically the main question that I will ask is, how is the interest rate determined in the short run in an economy? Okay, so how do we determine what determines the interest rate? Okay, so essentially what I have to derive here is a money market or a financial market where there's a supply and demand for money. Okay, when you heard today that the Reserve Bank did not change the cash rate, that was something I can analyze here. So what happens? Well, nothing happens if they didn't change the cash rate, but if they would have changed the cash rate, what would have happened to the money market? Okay? So that's what I'm going to do today. Unfortunately, I cannot continue on Monday because there's some sort of public holiday, but I hopefully will be able to finish the whole thing by next Wednesday. Okay, so what we would like to derive today is an equilibrium in the money market. So there's some sort of supply, and the supply will be basically what the Reserve Bank or the central bank is doing, and a demand for money. So that's what basically you are doing. Okay, so you have some sort of demand for cash that you carry around with you, and this is determined by certain things. Right? And that's what we want to derive. So a simple theory of the demand for money. Okay, okay, so there's several interest rates around there. One is basically set by the Reserve Bank. So here we have the 3 months and 6 months bills, so that's basically the interest rate the government has to pay, or very good creditors, and the cash rate. Okay, so the cash rate is what the central bank sets. So in some sense, that's their main instrument, in Australia at least, to conduct a monetary policy. So I will come back to this again. So they don't really actually. So if they said yesterday we'd leave the cash rate unchanged, this is probably not true in the sense that they don't really set the cash rate. Okay, the cash rate is an interest rate that banks have to pay each other if they take a loan overnight. Okay, so at the end of the day, the ANZ is running out of funds. Then they go on this market, ask whatever, the Bank of Queensland or whatever, do you have some funds available? And basically the interest rate they have to pay is the rate, the cash rate, that's the rate from one day to the next. Okay, so that's an overnight rate. It's called cash rate in Australia. For example, in the United States, that's a federal funds rate. It's essentially the same thing. Okay. But still, there's a market. Okay, so the Bank of Queensland could, they basically say, okay, under these and these conditions, we lend you so and so many billions of dollars or whatever the ANZ would need overnight. So there's a market for it. So the cash rate that actually is around is not necessarily exactly what the Reserve Bank says it is. They have a target. They would like to have it at 4.25% or something on an annual rate. But they do not set the cash rate. Okay, so if you read today in the newspapers, the Reserve Bank left the cash rate unchanged. That's technically wrong. They have a target. So what they do, they're also active on the financial markets. What they do is they buy and sell bonds, government bonds. And that's the same thing, for example, what the Reserve Bank in the United States would do. Okay, so they do what we call open market operations. They sell and buy bonds, for example, to banks. And by doing this, they make more funds or less funds available to private banks. Okay, so they change the financial conditions for private banks. And the goal of doing these open market operations by selling or buying bonds is kind of to keep the cash rate at or near the target. Okay, so there are small deviations. I think I have some pictures later on that actually the cash rate is not actually always at the target. It's very close to it, but it's not necessarily every day at whatever 4.25% is happening. Okay. So why does it matter? Well, of course, once we would like to explain what's happening on financial markets, in particular on the money market. But there, of course, is going to be some feedback, right? So in particular, investment decisions by firms will be determined by the interest rate, okay? Because quite often firms do not have enough cash flow around to buy all the new investment goods they want to buy out of their cash that they have floating around. They often have to take a credit or a loan, right? And of course, the loan comes with some price, and that's the interest rate. Okay, so there's the feedback. So if the monetary authority, the central bank, kind of moves the interest rate around, however they're going to do it, and you're going to have some idea at least by next Wednesday, that's going to affect the interest rate, and that's going to affect the ability of firms, say, to conduct investment activities. Similar to consumption, not all consumption that we conduct can we just pay just out of our, pocket. So often also, especially for consumer durables or cars, etc., we often need to take a loan as well. So there again is a feedback to the goods market. Okay, so we put everything together next week or the week thereafter when we put all the markets together. Today we only want to talk about the money market. Okay, so basically the main thing I want to tell you is what is monetary policy? How can we set up a very simple model that can explain the operating procedures of the central bank and how do they affect the money market, and then later on how do they affect the overall economy, for example, level of GDP, etc. Okay, so that's what we want to. That's the main lesson that you should get out of it. Okay, there's a couple of assumptions similarly to, basically asymmetric to what we had before. So here, before we left the interest rate fixed, i.e. we kept the level of investment fixed in the last lectures, right? So when we had investment, we had this I somewhere, and we put this bar over it. So that's a variable that's exogenous to the system for the time being. But of course, as I already said, investment decisions are often determined by the financial environment, particularly the interest rate. Okay, so when we talked about the goods market, we kept the interest rate constant, and therefore the level of investment constant. What we do here now is keep the level of GDP exogenous. Okay, so that's just simply an assumption to start out and keep things simple. Okay, neither of these are probably good assumptions if you want to describe a real economy because GDP is changing and the interest rates are changing and investment is changing over time. But we do this simply to add little steps first. And once we have all these little steps added up, we have a real nice model of the economy. Okay, so we keep this relatively simple. Okay, so what is money? What do you want to talk about? Okay, so basically, when I talk about the financial markets here, I have two assets in mind, or two ways how you can store value. And one is money, and the other one is bonds. Okay. So the big difference between money and bonds is that bonds pay a positive interest rate, which we call little I, and money doesn't. Right? So by holding money, you basically forgo. So if you have some wealth and you hold this wealth in money instead of, say, invested into bonds, you do not obtain the interest. Okay. Whereas it's probably sometimes harder if you would put all your wealth into bonds to conduct transactions. Because if you go with some government bonds as a piece of paper to Woolworth and want to pay for your grocery bill, you probably will not be successful. Right? So what you do to actually conduct transactions, and that's essentially a convention, right? I mean, that's just basically how the law is. That all shops in an economy have to accept money, right? And money is currency, okay? So that's money that you can actually touch, or current account deposits, okay? So basically, sort of money that you have sitting at the bank, essentially at no interest, and but that you can access very easily, okay, with your FPOS card, etc., or with a check, okay. So that's what we want to talk about. But these are basically the assets, or not basically, these are the assets that I allow here in this lecture. Okay. There's a lot of stuff on page 9, 10, 11, or 10 that you can just skip. These are assumptions. They're not so important. So let's think about what determines our holding of currency. Okay, so I bet everybody of us has some sort of, some money or currency with here at this lecture. So what determines this? So why don't we just hold all our wealth in something that gives us some interest? Okay. Well, it's because there's basically two reasonings that come into mind here. A, we want to conduct some transactions. We want to buy things with money. And the other one is if we just only have money, we do not obtain any interest that we alternatively could get. Okay. So that's the starting point how we can think about what's the optimal demand for money in an economy, or for you. Okay. So there's some trade-off between these two things. Of course, if you want to buy things, you need some currency, or have some of your wealth that you have, or the income that you have it in forms of currency or your checking account. Alternatively, you can put it into bonds. So if you have more transactions that you plan for a given period, well, of course, then you would hold more currency, okay, more money. Alternatively, what happens, say, if the interest rates on bonds or other assets that you alternatively could put in your income, what would happen then? Well, walking around with all this currency comes at a cost, right? So if the interest rate is very high, then you forgo this potential interest income. Okay. So that is what we economists call there's opportunity cost of bonds. So ideally, you would hold everything you have in bonds and get some interest on it. But you can't, because you also have to conduct some transactions. You have to buy bread, groceries, and whatever you buy, newspapers. Okay? So there's some trade-off. There's two aspects to it. So if the level of transaction goes up, you would like to hold more money. Your demand for money goes up. And if the rate of interest on bonds goes down, you would also, because of the lower opportunity cost, would be inclined to have a higher demand for money. Okay, so these are what probably is the simplest way of thinking about what determines the demand for money is two things. The opportunity cost, or the interest on alternative assets, and the level of transactions. Alright, so we can put this all into one equation. Okay, so what we have here is our money demand function. Okay, so D stands here for demand. And that's a very simple model, the simplest model I can think of, that determines the level of demand for money in an economy. And it comes with two parts. A is this first part, which we call the nominal income. Or you might think about, this is of course not only the demand function for money for one individual. Think this is the demand function for an overall economy. So this could be the nominal GDP in an economy. Okay? So if the nominal GDP goes up, more money is demanded. Of course, you might think, well, there are some transactions that are counted in GDP that are not actually paid for with cash. That's true, but for simplicity, let's assume that these things are somewhat proportional. Okay, so not necessarily every unit of GDP is actually bought with cash, but if GDP goes up, then the proportion stays constant of all the transactions that are also increasing. Okay, so that's the first part. So it is a function of the nominal income, of nominal GDP in an economy. And it's a positive function, right? So here we have, on the left-hand side of this equation, the demand for money. So if GDP goes up, if this thing becomes bigger, the demand for money goes up too. Okay, so there's a positive relationship. So if nominal GDP goes up, then the demand for money goes up as well. Okay? We can see this. Can you see it there? See if I have a better one. Probably not. I will try to take it. Okay, so if nominal GDP goes up, money demand will go up. Okay. But then the opportunity cost comes into play. So I already said that little I denotes the interest rate in an economy. Okay, so this is the nominal interest rate. And specifically, let's assume that's the interest rate on bonds in an economy. So that's the interest rate on the alternative asset where I can store my income. So abstracting from this part, we have this term here. So we assume that money demand is a function of the interest rate. But we already discussed that if the interest rate goes up, people are inclined to hold or decrease their demand for money, okay, because of the higher interest rate or higher opportunity cost. So what we have here is a negative function of the interest rate. Meaning if the interest rate goes up, then money demand goes down. Okay? So often we write this then here as a negative function, or you can think about that the partial derivative of this thing is negative. Okay, so if I goes up, L goes down, the demand for money goes down. Okay, so and just the function is a general function. It can be sloped this way, or it's sloped negative. We just keep it very general. Okay, so we just assume it's a negative function of the interest rate. Okay, so let's draw it. What do we have here? Okay, so let's draw our money demand function that we have here. Where we have here the interest rate on the vertical axis, and on the horizontal axis we have money demand. Okay? Second. Okay, we have the interest rate here and money demand there. We don't have a better pen. Okay. So we have two variables here. So we have the money demand function, and that was given as this. Okay, so we have two variables here. And one thing that's, again, exogenous, because we have assumed that nominal GDP is constant for the time being, or it's exogenous to this thing. Okay? So here again, we have our endogenous variables on the two axes, on the vertical and on the horizontal axis. And this is a constant. Okay? Because it's exogenous when we draw this. Okay? All right. So how can we draw this? Well, we measure here the demand and here the interest rate. And we have assumed there's a negative relationship. And this negative relationship describes the opportunity cost of money demand, of holding money. Okay. That means that if the interest rate is high, money demand will be low. So if we have a high interest rate, money demand will be relatively low. If the interest rate is relatively low, the opportunity costs of holding money will be low. If the opportunity costs are low, we don't lose that much by running around with more cash. So the demand for money will go up. In the extreme, if the interest rate will be zero, there would be no opportunity cost. So there would be no reason to invest or hold some of my wealth in the form of bonds, because I wouldn't get anything for it. If the interest rate on bonds would be zero, why would I, buy some bonds? In particular, that would be costly, because then some of this, or whatever I invest in bonds, I can't use to buy bread, say. Okay? So it wouldn't make any sense if the interest rate is zero or close to zero to have any bonds. Okay? So if the interest rate is very, very low, my money demand would be relatively big. Okay? So I can connect all these points, and I get to this. So this is my money demand function. For a given level of nominal GDP. Okay, so it's not real GDP. When we talked about GDP in the last lecture, I didn't have this dollar sign in there because I only talked about real GDP. But if you multiply it with the price level, with the GDP deflator, you get to nominal GDP, right? So you've discussed that already in macro one. But why don't I use here, so that's just my convention, that I write this here as the nominal money demand function. Okay, so I just, to make sure that it's not the real demand for money, it's the nominal demand for money. Okay, so I do not convert it into some real units by dividing by the GDP deflator or price level. Okay. So you have a negative relationship. Interest rate high, demand for money low. Interest rate low, demand high. Okay? So now we can think about what happens if the only exogenous variable here would shift. What would happen to this demand function that is negatively sloped if GDP, say, doubles? What happens in this case? What do you think happens if GDP doubles to this demand function? Stay where it is, if it moves to the left, if it moves to the right.
To the right.
Exactly. Of course, there's more transactions that you want to conduct. So you need more money. Okay, so nominal GDP goes up. This goes up and moves to the right. Okay, so that's exactly what's on the next slide. Here again, we have the old money demand function, and now we assume that GDP goes up to dollar sign Y prime. Okay, so that's bigger. So as was already correctly said, what happens? The money demand function moves to the right. Think about this for a given interest rate. Okay, so this interest rate that's denoted here. So for a given interest rate, I will increase, or everybody will increase their demand for money by this amount. Okay. Everything is, as we have assumed here, that the money demand function would be given as this. Then in this case, if the money demand is linear in nominal GDP, a doubling of GDP would also double the demand for money. Right? So sometimes later, the whole thing will be in a more general form. Or if you read other textbooks, then sometimes it's written like this, where money demand is a function, a general function of GDP, and a general function of the interest rate. Okay, so sometimes if you use other textbooks, or have used other textbooks and all of a sudden are confused, that's just the very simple form that's used in the current textbook. In Blanc-Charchin, more general forms would, be something like this, where still money demand is a negative function, should have nominal GDP, a negative function of the interest rate, and a positive function, So the partial derivative of this thing with respect to nominal GDP would be positive. Okay? This means that the partial derivative with respect to nominal GDP is positive. Okay, so if nominal GDP goes up, money demand goes up, but could be again 1 for 1, could be less or more than 1 for 1. Okay, but you don't need partial derivatives to pass this course. But sometimes it's probably going to be helpful. Okay, so that's a shift, an exogenous shift in nominal GDP is going to shift the money demand function to the right. Okay, let's construct an equilibrium. Okay, so let's assume there's for a moment no private banks, so there's no checking accounts, etc. So money can only be in one form, that's in currency. Okay? I can loosen that assumption. And I will do this in a couple of, probably not today, but next week. But nothing much really is gained by it. It's probably more detailed, say more realistic description of financial market. But the punchline is probably already here. Okay, so let's keep things simple. So there's only two things that you can do. You actually hold your wealth in paper money or coins or in government bonds. Okay, there's nothing else. There's no banks where you can put your money and no ATMs, etc. Okay? So all the paper money in circulation must come from somewhere. And usually, in most countries nowadays, this is done by what we call a central bank. Okay? There's one agency that's closely connected to the government that prints all this money. Okay? It wasn't always this case. For example, in the United States, until the Federal Reserve was only founded in 1913, so before that there was no centralized central bank in the United States. And if you go even further back, basically anybody could print money. Okay. Okay, so there were different dollars circulating in the United States at some points in the past, and they were all issued these, this paper money by private banks. Okay. So having currency in circulation is not necessarily a product of a government-related central bank. Okay, so potentially this could also be all done by private banks. But that's how it's not usually done, and since we are describing here want some model of the Australian economy in the end, we assume that there's some central bank, which we could call the RBA, that prints all this money. Okay? So somehow they bring this money in circulation. So I jump one step, I don't tell you exactly yet how they do that. So we just assume that this money is just around. Okay? So they print a lot of money and this money is in circulation. And that's basically how we can get to our equilibrium. Okay, so there's some supply of money. So that's what's in the control of the central bank. So they print money, and this money is in circulation. Okay, I don't tell you really why the central bank is doing it. So in particular, I assume that the amount of money that's in circulation is independent of the interest rate. It's really exogenous to this money. Okay? So we don't really have a story of what the RBA is doing, why they're doing things at the moment. So if we think about this in our little model here, that would be an exogenous thing. And we call this MS. Okay, so that's the supply of money, okay, of nominal money. Okay, so then of course, since we're always interested in equilibria in an economy or in our models, whereas demand equals supply, we have right here very quickly our equilibrium on the money market. So that we have here on the right hand side our demand for money that we had before. Okay, so we have here MD, and on the left hand side our supply. Okay, so that's our money market equilibrium. There's some exogenously given supply of money and some demand. And in equilibrium, those two have to be the same. If they are the same, we say that the money market is clear. Demand equals supply. So let's look at this in a picture, in a graph where we plot these two curves. And what this does here is going to determine the interest rate on this market. How is this happening? Well, again, here we have money on the horizontal axis and the interest rate on the vertical axis. This is our money demand function. This is exactly the function that we've seen before. Okay? So the only additional thing here is that we introduce money supply. And as I said, money supply is exogenous, so it's not bigger or smaller when there's lower or higher interest rates. So it's independent of the interest rate. And if I withdraw this means that it's not becoming bigger when the interest rate goes up or smaller when the interest rate goes up. It's independent of the interest rate. So this line indicating money supply is parallel to the vertical axis. Okay? That's what I mean with this exogenous variable. It's independent of the size of the interest rate. Okay? So that's all currency in circulation, and that's the demand. But there's one point where these two things are exactly the same. That's this point A. Only this point is the demand and the supply the same. And what comes out of here is an interest rate where the money market is cleared. Okay? So here's demand equals supply. If the interest rate would be whatever higher, the supply would be greater than the demand. So what would happen? The price would go down. Same here. If you're somewhere here, the demand is higher for money than the supply. What would happen? Everybody wants some money, and the interest rate will go up. Okay. So there's only one point where these two curves intersect, and that's the equilibrium on the money market. Okay. Just very quickly, so I'm giving you some idea that I just don't make this up totally out of whack with reality. Okay. So the big thing here is that money demand is negatively related to the interest rate. Let's look at the data. Let's try to see if we can see something like this in the data. So we had our money market equilibrium which was given as this. And I have to zoom out a bit. And what do I have here? Well, here I plot two things. I plot the interest rate, that's a nominal interest rate for Australia, from 1960 to 2008. So that's the blue line. So the interest rate was not always as low as it is at the moment. It was much higher during the 1970s and 1980s. And I have the ratio of money to nominal income. So what I do, I divide both sides here by nominal money. So what I plot is this part of my money demand function. Okay? Okay, so this has to hold. So I plot this here. And then I see how this part of my money demand function moves up and down when the interest rate goes up or down. Okay? So the interest rate is what we have here, and this is my interest rate related part, or my interest rate dependent part of money demand. What do we see here? Well, we see that in periods where the interest rate is relatively low, my money demand is relatively high. In periods where the interest rate is relatively high, my money demand is relatively low. And then again, after about 1995, when the interest rate was low again, my money demand was relatively high again. So that's exactly what I wanted to capture with my negative dependency of money demand on changes in the interest rate, of the nominal interest rate. Okay? So here in one picture, I show you that money demand apparently is following my assumption that I'm making regarding the behavior of people. Okay. All right. So, how does the central bank, or the central bank in Australia, do things? And usually when you read about this, you only hear about the RBA changing the cash rate. That's not really how they do monetary policy. That's the only touch upon, right? What they do is they try to influence this cash rate. And this cash rate is the interest rate charged on overnight loans between financial intermediaries, different private banks. Okay? So by the end of the day, they always have to move funds around because sometimes there's some shift because one bank buys a lot and from some other bank, and then they have to move things around, and also have to have certain funds at the Reserve Bank. So basically, by the end of the day, some banks might be in demand for some loans, and others have some money left over. So there's always, potentially at least, there's a market for overnight loans between different banks. Of course, banks are not stupid. They don't give the money away for free. You know, they charge an interest rate on it. And that interest rate is called the cash rate. So there's a market for this. And what the Reserve Bank is doing is they set a target for this cash rate. Okay? So when they decided yesterday to keep the cash rate at 425 basis points, that's just their target. That's where they would like to see the cash rate. Cash rate might deviate from this. Okay. But of course, in between central bank meetings, they're not just lounging somewhere in Sydney and watch the ocean. They do something. They try to influence this market for overnight loans. And how do they do this? Okay, so how do they do this? You know, their monetary policy. Well, that's what we call open market operation. Okay. So what the Reserve Bank is doing, is basically doing every day, or potentially every day, is they are active on the so-called open market. The open market for government bonds. Okay. So they buy and sell bonds to other actors on this market, usually financial intermediaries, other private banks. Okay. And by doing this, they give more or less funds to the private banks. So they influence, the funds that they have available. And they do this because they have this target, the cash rate. So if the cash rate goes up, then not enough funds are in the system. Right? Because the cash rate goes up, banks are in need for money, but there are not enough funds there. So if the interest rate or the cash rate goes up, what would the central bank do? Well, they would have to increase the funds available to the banking sector. By doing that, more funds are around, the stress on the overnight market would go down, and the cash rate would go down. Otherwise, if the cash rate becomes lower and lower, banks don't need funds. What they would do the opposite. They would just suck out the funds out of the system. So how do they do this? Why do they do this? By buying and selling bonds. Okay? And And I jump one slide. So we only talk about the cash rate, but of course the cash rate is kind of linked to all the other interest rates in an economy. Okay, so if you just look at T-bills here, and if you look at, rates that you have to buy or pay for your housing loan, they are relatively related to this. Okay, so if the cash rate goes up, basically the whole set of interest rates in the economy will go up, and if the cash rate goes down, all the others will go down. Okay, so they're pretty much related. So I put some other interest rates in here. They would look very, very similar. Okay, so because nobody of us basically gets a loan at the cash rate. That's the best rate you can maybe think of. Nobody gets a loan at these conditions. At least nobody in this room. Okay. And just quickly, because I already mentioned this and I have to back it up. This is these are two things here. Let's just look at this graph here. And let me just zoom it in, that you can see it better. What do we have here? Here we have the cash rate from, I think, 93 to 2010 as this red line. Is it red for you? Yeah. It's not even red for you. We have to zoom in more. Say stop and it looks red. So here. So I have two lines here. So I have the cash rate, that's the daily cash rate for Australia from 93 to 2010. And I have two things. The red line, that's the target. That's what the Reserve Bank sets. And the black line is the actual cash rate. And at least at the, on the left side here, until about 2002, there's periods where these two are not exactly the same. Okay. So the actual cash rate, what financial intermediaries have to pay, follows more or less this target but the central bank is not, or the reserve bank was not always 100% able to make this cash rate exactly equal to their target. So there's deviations. The deviation is relatively small, okay, so there's only a couple of basis points, but still there are deviations of these two. Okay. Over time, you see the deviation becomes smaller and smaller. The reserve bank must have become better and better to target things. Okay, so the deviation of these two, I don't see any deviations here, really, of these two. But they don't have to be exactly the same. Okay. So what I do on not on Monday, but on next Wednesday, is tell you how the reserve bank actually influences the cash rate. Okay, thanks.
I actually wanted to ask you, I got a... Yeah, it's not.
Let me see, 1 second.